gospel reading today, we're following the story of the road to Emmaus. Now, a couple of people asked, what's so special about Emmaus? What does it mean to go to Emmaus? Because I don't really understand that. Well, you know what? We don't really know what was so special about Emmaus. We can only speculate. We're not sure whether those disciples actually lived in Emmaus or whether they were just trying to escape what had happened in Jerusalem. We're not quite sure. It tells us they went to a house, and we're going to hear that today, and they sat with Jesus. And so we sort of assume that Cleopas lived in Emmaus, but nobody's really sure. And so you see, the point of the story is not Emmaus itself. The point of the story is an encounter with the risen Lord. An encounter with two disciples who didn't even realize they were with him. How many of us go through our lives like that? So listen to today's reading. It comes from the Gospel of Luke in the 24th chapter. Now, as they came near the village to which they were going, Jesus walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. And when he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" This is the word of our Lord.
Praise be to God.
Let us pray. Gracious God, do grant that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One of my favorite television shows from the 1970s is the sitcom MASH. Anybody else like that show? Used to watch it all the time. It was about a group of doctors and nurses trying to make sense of their assignment to the 4077 MASH unit during the Korean War. And in one particular episode, Major Winchester, who is always so prim and proper and always protects himself from the horror of suffering and death around him, finally breaks down, and he's left defenseless. He slips into depression, and he struggles to find some answers to life's most perplexing problem: death. And finally, in utter desperation, he sneaks off the base. He just leaves, and he goes up to the battalion station, which is the first line of defense. It's where the people that are injured on the battlefield get taken as soon as they're injured, to be then triaged to the MASH unit. And he's hiding out it there looking for answers. And Colonel Potter finally discovers where he is, and he calls him up and he orders him to come right back. But while he's on the phone, a medical corpsman interrupts him and says that he's needed. And he calls him over to a man who's dying. Winchester confirms the man's impending death with a glance. Obviously, the man is in pain. And the soldier cries out, "I can't see anything. Hold my hand." And the major grabs his hand and holds on. And the soldier whispers, "I'm dying." The major, still groping for answers, demands from him, "Can you see anything? Can you feel anything? I have to know." But the dying soldier doesn't answer any of those questions. Instead, all he manages to say is, "I smell bread." Isn't that odd? Major Winchester, what he wants, what he craves, what he has to have are all the answers to pain, all the waning destruction, all the tragedy and suffering around him. Can you see anything? Can you feel anything? I have to know. And what he gets instead of an answer is a fragrance, a symbol, an image, an experience. For all the dying soldier can muster in the midst of his own pain and suffering is, I smell bread. That's it. I smell bread. Well, I have to tell you, lately I've been feeling a lot like Major Winchester, overwhelmed by all the pain and suffering around us. And I have to admit that I too long for answers sometimes. In fact, there's a number of times this week, today in particular, that I too long for answers. You can't help but pick up a newspaper and read about all the war all over the world. All the famine, all the hurting, all the senseless murders. After visiting a woman in a nursing home this week who's dying without any companionship of family or friends. After listening this week to a teenager who's struggling with a lot of peer problems. There have been a lot of times this week when I wanted to raise my voice to heaven pleading for an explanation. I want to know about suffering. I want to know why it happens, and I want to know how to stop it. And so I turned to the scriptures because it's the only place I know to go. Thumbing through for some help. And then I thought about the worship schedule for this week, communion. And suddenly I realized that I might not get all the answers that I long for, but what I do get is the smell of bread. I too get a fragrance, an image, a symbol. What I get is the smell of bread. And surprisingly, I'm not the first to have that experience. Today, our disciples are making their way to Emmaus. They actually arrived there. They're talking and they're discussing the betrayal of Christ, the suffering of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ, and they've even heard stories about the perplexing resurrection of Christ. Now, the empty tomb doesn't get a lot of homiletic press. Few words are ever said about the empty tomb. We don't spend a lot of time on the vacant grave. Once the empty tomb is noted, we jump right in to the transition to the resurrection of Jesus. We'd rather not stop and linger beside an empty grave, scratching our heads, but that's what happens after the resurrection. You see, John records it in kind of an anticlimactic way, that some of the disciples, once they saw that the tomb was open, they went home. And Mark's gospel ends in a similar way. Once the women saw the empty grave, they ran home and they didn't say a word to anyone. No bulletin announcement of Jesus' resurrection, just contemplation of the empty tomb. When we lose a loved one, we treat the body with respect. We lay it to its rest on the day of the funeral, and this helps us acquire some sense of closure. It brings an important part of the grieving process, allowing us some closure. However, that also stirs up a lot of feelings for us. Tangible reminders of tangled memories, regrets, sadness, unfinished business, and unanswered questions. But the corpseless tomb of Jesus changes all of that. Death was powerless to hold Jesus in its grip. The vacant grave proclaims that death no longer has the last word, and the corpse has lost its powerful voice. This means that believers are called to live without a sense of closure. And yet, God cannot be boxed into our limited imagination or expectations, even though we try time and time again to do that. Life does not end in the cemetery. We should never mistake the empty tomb as some just minor detail of the passion, because it's easily glossed over as incidental. But on the contrary, it speaks with a powerful voice of the unfinished story of a life of faith. An open-ended journey prepared by God that leads to the place that we cannot even begin to imagine. An empty grave testifies that this is a venture that even death, the final enemy, was powerless to stop. And so our two travelers meet Jesus on the road. And as they talk, Jesus says, "Are you the only two?" They say to Jesus, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening?" And then when they come to the village of Emmaus, Jesus starts to walk on because he was heading somewhere else, they thought. But they urge him to stay. And it's when he takes that bread and breaks it. It's when that aroma of bread filled the house where they were staying that they recognized that this stranger among them was the risen Christ. It's at that moment and none others that those two disciples recognized the stranger as the risen Christ. And they say to each other as if they're kicking themselves, "Were our hearts not burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures up to us?" And yet even when he listened to the depth of their disappointment and grief, even when he interpreted the scriptures to them, they still didn't recognize him. Now, I don't know about you, but that makes me a little nervous. If Jesus himself couldn't reveal the truth to them through his interpreting, through his enlightening, through his explaining, if Jesus couldn't answer their questions to their satisfaction, I'm in big trouble. And the bad news is we're not told exactly why they didn't get it. I could speculate, because sometimes our grief is so great that we need more. Sometimes we need more than someone to listen to us. Sometimes it's as important as that. Sometimes we need more than enlightenment and interpretation and explanation, as important as all that is. The truth is, sometimes our grief is so great that we need more. What we need, even more than answers, is an experience. We need an experience of the living, risen Christ. What we need is some tangible evidence that God knows what we're up against. That God knows the depth of human suffering, not only knows about it, but has experienced it firsthand. What we need is an experience of the risen Christ so that we can believe again in all things. In all things. In all the things that we have to face. Tragedy, suffering, even death. God still works together for good for those who love God and are called according to divine purposes, it says in the book of Romans. What we need is the smell, the feel, the taste of bread. Because this bread is the risen Christ. This bread is the living Lord. This bread has the answers that we yearn for, that we forget, that even though we try to remember, when we're stuck in the midst of our grief, we forget. And yet this table reminds us every time we come that those answers are there, that experience is there. Reminds us that Jesus knows our loss, that Jesus endured our shame, that Jesus knows our pain and suffering, that Jesus died our death, that Jesus was broken, but that he rose again. I suspect that's why you came today, because you needed to hear that again. I know I needed to hear that today. Because I'm guessing that in your lives in recent weeks, as well in the lives of those that you know and love around, you've become discouraged and maybe even doubtful again. We've all been searching for answers to our questions like, who allows suffering and why does it happen and how can we do anything to stop it? And although we've been searching for answers, what we really need is an experience of the risen Christ. And I've got good news for you. I smell bread.